it's conventional in a different culture of which I am a part to mark the completion of the reading or studying of a particular set of texts with a celebratory, I guess, meal, or it's called a siyum. When people finish reading or really learning, studying a tractate of the Talmud, they will mark that with a siyum and a minyan. I do not have a minyan, and I do not have a tractate of the Talmud, but I do have Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, just checking, which is the longest book that I have ever read. And true confessions, I have a hard time reading long books because I get intimidated by them, and I get intimidated by people who write long sentences also. And Mann does write long sentences, and yet I have successfully finished Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, and I think that's a big achievement. It's a big achievement because I'm doing it more to mark the extent to which this experience of reading this book was really impacting. I can't really say life-changing, but it was life-defining in a way. And Mann, to me, has more insight into certain Jewish philosophical perspectives or theological perspectives, whatever you want to call them, than most of the people in my neighborhood. I really learned a lot from the book. So I want to mark that with reading the end of the last paragraph of Joseph and His Brothers, which, by the way, Mann wrote between 1933 and 1943. So as the Jewish people are being extinguished, Mann decides to write Joseph and His Brothers, which really shows the extent, I mean, very simply put, and it's a giant simplification, that the Jewish God really runs the universe. Or, as we'll see here, at the end of this is the last, the convention is to read the last part of the book. So here we go. This is Joseph turning to his brothers after they have beseeched him to not punish them for their past deed. Joseph and his brothers ends at the end of Genesis, and it ends really with the completion of Joseph's story, and that's Joseph's triumph, and everything is leading up to Joseph's triumph. The end of Genesis ends with Jacob in a coffin, and that's where Joseph and his brothers ends as well. So even though in some way the book records the ascent of Joseph and the fulfillment of the divine plan for him to get where he gets, the story ends really at the beginning. That is, the Jewish people then, after Jacob goes to Egypt with all of his belongings and all of the tribes, then from that point on, the Jewish people suffer slavery. And it's interesting that Joseph's ascent is all designed to bring the Jewish people into slavery so they can be redeemed. And Mann is writing this story throughout World War II. This is what he said to them, Joseph to his brothers, and they laughed and wept together, and they all reached their hands out to him as he stood there in their midst, and they touched him and he caressed them as well. The physicality of the ending is very beautiful. And so ends this invention of God, this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. This invention of God for Mann means, essentially what it means is human history. This invention of God, this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. They laughed and wept together. Really going back to what I was saying before. There's the triumph, but there's also the suffering to come, the suffering that was undergone, and of course, the suffering that's most in the brothers' minds at this point is their abandonment of their brother in the hole, the pit, and their eventual plan to sell them to passing Arab merchants. So here's the penultimate paragraph. But brothers, dear old brothers, he replied, bowing to them with arms spread wide, what are you saying? You speak exactly as if you feared me and wanted me to forgive you. Am I as God? In the land below it is said I am as Pharaoh, and though as he is called God, he is but a dear, poor thing. From the perspective of the divine story, notwithstanding Paro's enormous wealth and his own self-proclaimed status as the son of God, he is, from Joseph's perspective, from the perspective of the invention of God, simply a poor thing. But in asking for my forgiveness, you have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. Wow, right? So here's Joseph saying to his brothers, you don't get that we are in a story, and it's true there may be many stories, but you don't get the big picture. You don't get the big story. In asking for my forgiveness, you have not, it appears, really understood the whole story we are in. I do not scold you for that. One can very easily be in a story without understanding it. I think part of the imperative of Mann's book is that when you're in a story, you should be aware that you're in that story. In Mann's representation, the brothers in some ways can be forgiven. How would they have known the story? The story was known to Jacob. The story was known to Joseph, but not really to the brothers, only insofar that he represented it to them in dreams. And Joseph himself admits that the way he presented those dreams could not have spoken to them in the way that he would have wanted them to, if he had wanted them to understand. I mean, Joseph, he understands and regrets his own behavior as an adolescent. Perhaps it was meant, and that's Mann's interpretation of the story, but it's clearly the story as well. Mann makes a distinction between the story, the fairy tale, and the commentary. And the fairy tale is really the story that we read in the Old Testament, the story that we read in the Bible, and the commentary is Mann. And once we read the commentary, we understand the story, the fairy tale, much better. And at that point, only after that moment of interpretation, only at that point does the story become itself. Then the fairy tale is no longer a fairy tale; it is a story. One can very easily be in a story without understanding. Perhaps it was meant to be that way, and I have only myself to blame for always understanding too well the game that was being played. Did you not hear it from our Father's lips as he gave me my blessing, that in my case it has always been merely a playful game and an echo? A playful game insofar that we already know how it's going to turn out. Perhaps an echo of that story that God has already told. I think that's what echo is here. And in his departing words to you, Jacob's blessing of the 12 tribes, and his departing words to you, did he even mention the nasty thing that happened between you and me? No, he said nothing of it, for he was also part of the game of God's playful game. It's strange. Jacob is part of God's playful game, but he does suffer, and Joseph does suffer. Joseph has to ask his father's forgiveness for making him suffer for all those years without telling him where he was. In a way, the story in Genesis, especially as it's rendered by Mann, but as it's rendered by the rabbis, as it's represented in Genesis itself, note that there is nothing beyond representation. There always is only representation. So in the representation also in Genesis, Jacob suffers immeasurably, and Joseph feels guilt about it. But here Mann says, nonetheless, he was part of that playful game. Under his protection, I had to rouse you by my brazen immaturity to do evil. Here's Joseph turning back on himself and seeing with clarity what he was doing when he revealed his dreams of lordship to his brother. To his brothers. But God indeed turned it to good, so that I fed many people and matured a little myself besides. So God made it good. I fed many people, meaning Joseph goes down to Egypt, and what looked like a bad and terrible thing, the nearly ripping to shreds of Joseph and the ripping to shreds of his multicolored coat, that, although it was in some sense evil, and Mann does not deny that, we see that picture of the brothers' violence against Joseph very, very clearly. but still God is able to turn it to good from some perspective, from the perspective of God's playful game. I fed many people and matured a little myself besides. I think the modesty and humility of the last clause here, matured a little myself besides, makes the other part, and I fed many people, all the more powerful. But if it is a question of pardon among us human beings, then I am the one who should beg it of you. For you had to play the evildoers so that everything might turn out this way. Joseph says to his brothers, I need to forgive you, because in the play that I knew about and the play that God is the author of, you were given a bad part. You were given the role of the evildoers so that everything might turn out this way. And now I am supposed to make use of Pharaoh's power merely because it is mine to revenge myself on you for 3 days of chastisement in a well, and again turn to evil what God has turned to good. That's what revenge is, in a way. Where the revenge here, the needless revenge here, would be taking what had been turned to good and turning it again to evil. Don't make me laugh. For a man who, contrary to all justice and reason, uses power simply because he has it, one can only laugh at him. Of course, one needs to be at an almost divine perspective. Mann refers to it earlier in the book as having a serene delight in looking back at the past. The serenity makes the suffering bearable, such that it doesn't overwhelm the delight. Never erases the delight in Mann. It exists simultaneous with him, weeping and laughter. If not today, then sometime in the future. And it is the future we shall hold to. If we can't laugh today, maybe sometime in the future. Sleep in peace. Tomorrow, by God's counsel, we shall begin our journey back to the comical land of Egypt. Not by Pharaoh's counsel, not by Pharaoh's counsel, by God's counsel. Who's the author of the story here? Well, Mann is, but God. We shall begin our journey back to the comical land of Egypt. Comical because from this perspective, and I suppose at the end of the novel, we're at this sense of serene divinity, all of whatever the people of Israel will undergo, all their suffering, all the death, all of it, from some perspective which is not available now, or maybe from a glimpse at the end of the novel. That's something that's laughable. This is what he said to them, and they laughed and wept together. They didn't just laugh. This is what he said to them, and they laughed and wept together, and they all reached their hands out to him as he stood there in their midst, and they touched him and he caressed them as well. The story that says, look back with serenity and laughter at all the evils of the world, do it from almost that perspective of the divine, or at least it's the perspective in which you understand the divine story. But at the end of the book, Mann returns us to the physical, to the human. Mann makes there's nothing accidental. He's not just biding his time. From the divine back to the fleshly, back to the human. And they touched him and he caressed them as well. The book ends with love. And so ends this invention of God, this beautiful story of Joseph and his brothers. Mann does not want this book to end. The past 50 or 100 pages, he keeps on saying, well, the book it has to end soon, but hold on. He doesn't want to lose his readership. He says the best is yet to come, which is true of the novel, but also this invention of God. So Mann doesn't want the story to end. He doesn't want to stop telling it. It takes him 10 years to write it. Readers, if you start reading it, you don't want it to end because it really is God's story. Ta-da!